We'd met in college, back when I was a shy girl from a small Ohio town, dazzled by his confidence, his quick laugh, the way he'd lean across a diner table and make me feel like the only person in the room. He was studying business. I was piecing together an English degree, dreaming of writing stories someday. But dreams shift, don't they? By the time we married at 25, I was working as a receptionist at a dental office, and he was climbing the ladder at a marketing firm. We bought a little house in the suburbs of Columbus, with a sagging porch and a backyard just big enough for a grill. I loved that house. I loved the way the morning light spilled through the kitchen window, catching the steam from my coffee. I loved the life I thought we were building. Looking back, I can't pinpoint when the cracks started. Maybe it was the late nights he blamed on client dinners, or the way his eyes stopped meeting mine when we talked. By our 10th anniversary, I was 35, and I'd stopped asking why he smelled like perfume that wasn't mine. I told myself it didn't matter. We had a daughter, Emily, who was 7 then, with her father's dark curls and my quiet way of watching the world. She was enough to keep me anchored, enough to make me ignore the whispers in my head. I'd grown up watching my own mother forgive my father's drinking, his tempers. Because that's what marriage is, Sarah, she'd said, her voice thin as the dish towel she'd twist in her hands. I didn't want to be her, but somehow I was becoming her anyway. Sitting in that courtroom, I felt the weight of those years press against my chest. The divorce wasn't my idea. 6 months ago, Daniel had come home, set his briefcase by the door, and said, "I think we should separate." No fight, no warning, just those words, cold and final, like he was canceling a subscription. I'd stared at him, the pot of spaghetti bubbling on the stove, Emily's homework scattered across the table. "Why?" I'd asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He'd sighed, like I was exhausting him, and said, "I'm not happy, Sarah. Haven't been for a long time." That was it. No mention of the woman I'd later learn about, Lindsay, his co-worker, 10 years younger, with a laugh that carried across the office Christmas party I'd attended last year. No mention of the savings account he'd been draining for months, funneling money into a life I wasn't part of. The betrayal wasn't just the affair. It was the way he'd rewritten our story, made me the villain in his head. He told the lawyer I was distant, that I'd let myself go, that I'd never supported his dreams. I wanted to scream that I'd supported him through every promotion, every late night, every time he needed me to smile and play the perfect wife at his company events. But screaming wouldn't change anything. So I sat there, listening to his lawyer paint me as a ghost in my own marriage, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not yet. It was quieter, sharper, a clarity I hadn't known I still had. I'd always been good at keeping secrets. Growing up, I'd learned to hide my fears, my hopes, even my dreams, because my mother said they were too big for a girl like me. I'd hidden my pain from Emily, too, when she was little and Daniel's temper would flare. Not at us, but at the world, at his job, at the way life never matched his plans. I'd smile, make her pancakes, tell her Daddy was just tired. Now, though, I was done hiding. The secret I was keeping in that courtroom wasn't about pain, it was about power. For the first time in years, I had a plan, and Daniel had no idea what was coming. It started 3 months ago after I found the bank statements. I'd been cleaning out the attic, looking for Emily's old school projects to cheer her up. She was 19 now, at college, struggling with the news of our divorce. Tucked behind a box of Christmas lights was a folder, unlabeled, stuffed with papers. At first I thought it was junk. Old receipts, maybe. But then I saw the account numbers, the withdrawals, the transfers to a name I didn't recognize. Lindsay Harper. The amounts weren't huge, a few thousand here and there, but they added up. Nearly $50,000, gone from the savings we'd built together. The money I'd thought was for Emily's future, for our retirement, for the life we'd promised each other. I didn't cry. I sat on the attic floor, the dust settling around me, and I remembered a moment from my childhood. I was 10, maybe 11, sitting on the back porch with my father. He'd been sober that day, his hands steady as he carved a piece of wood into a little bird. "Sarah," he'd said, his voice soft, "don't ever let anyone take what's yours. Not your heart, not your pride, not your fight." I'd forgotten those words, buried them under years of trying to be the good wife, the good mother. But they came back to me that day in the attic, sharp as the knife he'd held. I didn't confront Daniel. I knew he'd lie, or worse, he'd turn it around, make me feel small. Instead, I started digging. I spent nights at the kitchen table, my laptop glowing, piecing together the truth. Lindsay wasn't just a fling. They'd been together for 2 years. She had an apartment downtown, paid for with our money. There were emails, too. I'd guessed his password years ago, back when I trusted him enough to never use it. Messages about trips they'd taken, weekends he'd told me he was working. Every word I read was a cut, but it was also a spark. I wasn't just hurt. I was awake. The plan came slowly, piece by piece. I didn't want to just win the divorce. I wanted to take back the life I'd let slip away. I started with the house. It was in both our names, but Daniel had always acted like it was his. Like my hours painting the walls, planting the garden, making it a home, didn't count. I hired a lawyer, a quiet woman named Margaret, who listened to my story without pity, just a nod that said she understood. She found a loophole in our mortgage agreement, something about joint ownership that Daniel's lawyer had overlooked. If I could prove I'd been the primary caretaker of the home, I could claim it outright. So I gathered evidence, receipts for every repair, photos of me fixing the porch, even Emily's drawings of our backyard, proof that this was my world, not his. But the house was just the start. The real revenge was quieter, deeper. I went back to writing. It had been years since I'd touched the stories I'd started in college, the ones Daniel had called cute, but never read. I found my old notebooks in the attic, the pages yellowed but the words still alive. I started writing again, late at night, after Emily called to check in, or when the house felt too empty. At first, it was just a way to survive, to pour out the pain I couldn't say aloud. But then I submitted a story to a local magazine, just on a whim. They published it. Then another. By the time the divorce hearing came, I had a small following. People who wrote to me saying my words made them feel seen. It wasn't about the money, though the checks helped. It was about remembering who I was before I became Daniel's wife. In the courtroom, I could feel Daniel's eyes on me, but I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. Margaret presented our case, her voice steady as she laid out the evidence. The bank statements, the emails, the proof that I'd been the heart of our home. The judge, an older man with tired eyes, listened quietly. When it was Daniel's turn, his lawyer tried to spin the story again, but it fell flat. The truth was too heavy, too real. I didn't smile when the judge ruled in my favor, granting me the house and most of the savings. I didn't need to. The victory wasn't in the ruling. It was in the woman I'd become to fight for it. As I left the courtroom, the air outside was crisp, the kind of autumn chill that makes you feel alive. I drove home, the radio off, just the hum of the engine and my own thoughts. I thought about Emily, how I'd call her tonight, tell her I was okay, that we were okay. I thought about the garden I'd plant next spring, the stories I'd write, the life I was building, not for Daniel, but for me. And as I pulled into the driveway, the sunset painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, I felt a quiet satisfaction settle in my chest. It wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic. It was real, like the weight of my own heart, finally free. The house was quiet when I stepped inside, the kind of quiet that feels like a held breath. I dropped my purse on the kitchen counter, the same counter where I'd rolled out dough for Emily's birthday cakes, where I'd sat with a glass of wine after arguments with Daniel, trying to convince myself we were fine. The light through the window was softer now, the sunset fading into dusk, and I stood there for a moment, letting the stillness wrap around me. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was mine. Not because of the judge's ruling, but because I'd fought for it. Because I'd remembered what it meant to fight for myself. I poured a glass of water, the faucet's familiar groan a small comfort, and sat at the table. My hands were steady, but my mind was racing, replaying the courtroom, Daniel's face, the way his shoulders had slumped when the judge spoke. I didn't hate him. That surprised me. For months I'd thought hate would be the fuel I needed to get through this. But now, sitting here, I realized it wasn't hate at all. It was something deeper, a kind of grief mixed with resolve, like the ache you feel when you let go of something heavy you've carried too long. I thought about calling Emily, but it was late, and she'd be in her dorm, probably studying or laughing with her roommates. She'd been my anchor through all of this, even when I tried to shield her. When I'd told her about the divorce, she'd been quiet for a long time, then said, "Mom, you deserve to be happy. You always made sure I was. But what about you?" Her words had stung, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. I'd spent so much of my life making sure everyone else was okay. Daniel, Emily, even my parents when I was younger. That I'd forgotten what happiness felt like for me. I pulled out my notebook, the one I'd been writing in for months. The pages were filled with stories, some fiction, some too close to my own life to call anything but truth. I flipped to a blank page and started writing, not a story this time, but a letter to myself. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I needed to make sense of the day, to anchor the victory in something solid. Asterisk Sarah. Asterisk I wrote. Asterisk you did it. Not just the divorce. Not just the house. But you. You're still here. The words looked small on the page, but they felt enormous. Like a promise I was finally ready to keep. That night, I dreamed of my father. Not the angry man he'd become in his later years, but the one from that day on the porch, carving the wooden bird. In the dream, he looked at me, his eyes clear, and said, "You kept your fight, didn't you?" I woke up with tears on my cheeks, the kind that come from somewhere deep, where memory and longing tangle. I lay there in the dark, the house creaking softly around me, and I thought about how much I'd lost. Not just Daniel, but the girl I'd been, the one who believed love was enough to fix anything. But I hadn't lost everything. I'd found something too. Myself, maybe, or at least the start of her. The next morning I woke early, the sky still grey outside. I made coffee, the ritual as familiar as breathing, and stood by the window, watching the neighbor's dog chase its tail in the yard next door. Life was moving forward, whether I was ready or not. I'd work in a few hours. My job at the dental office had become full-time after the separation. A steady rhythm of answering phones, scheduling appointments, chatting with patients who'd known me for years. They'd been kind, most of them, asking how I was holding up without prying too much. Small-town kindness, the kind that doesn't demand answers but offers a smile anyway. At work, the day passed in a blur of phone calls and paperwork. During my lunch break, I sat in the break room, a sandwich untouched on the table, and checked my email. There was a message from the magazine editor, the one who'd published my stories. They wanted another piece, something personal this time, about overcoming. My first instinct was to say no. Writing about myself felt too raw. too exposed. But then I thought about the women who read my stories, the ones who'd sent me letters saying they saw themselves in my words. Maybe this was part of the fight, too, not just for the house or the money, but for the right to tell my story, to be seen. I started writing that night, after dinner, the house lit by the soft glow of a single lamp. The words came slowly at first, halting, like they were afraid to be true. I wrote about the divorce, but not the courtroom or the bank statements. I wrote about the small moments, the way Daniel's laugh had once made my heart lift, the way I'd memorized the sound of his car pulling into the driveway, the way I'd stopped looking in mirrors because I didn't recognize the woman staring back. I wrote about the attic, the dust on my fingers, the realization that I'd been betrayed not just by him, but by my own silence, and I wrote about the morning after the courtroom, the coffee in my hand, the quiet certainty that I was enough. By the time I finished, it was nearly midnight, and my hands were trembling. Not with fear, but with something else. Pride, maybe, or relief. I sent the story to the editor before I could change my mind, then went to bed, the weight of the day lifting just a little. The next few weeks were a rhythm of work, writing, and phone calls with Emily. She was coming home for Thanksgiving, her first visit since the divorce was finalized, and I wanted the house to feel like hers again, not a battleground of memories. I painted the living room, a soft blue that caught the light, and bought new curtains, simple ones that let the sun in. Small changes, but they made the space feel like mine, like ours. The magazine published my story a week before Emily's visit. I didn't tell anyone, not even her, but when the issue arrived in the mail, I sat on the couch and read it, my own words staring back at me. It was strange seeing my life laid bare like that, but it was also powerful. I wasn't just Sarah, the receptionist, the ex-wife, the mother. I was Sarah, the woman who'd survived, who'd fought, who'd found her voice again. Emily arrived the day before Thanksgiving, her car rattling into the driveway just as I was pulling a pie from the oven. She looked older somehow, her curls pulled back, her eyes carrying a weight I hadn't noticed before. We hugged, and I held her a little longer than usual, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo. "The house looks different," she said, glancing around. "It looks lighter." I smiled, not trusting my voice, and we spent the evening cooking, laughing, talking about everything except Daniel. She didn't ask about him, and I didn't offer. Some things didn't need to be said. That night, after she went to bed, I found a letter tucked into my notebook, one I hadn't seen before. It was from Daniel, dated a week after the courtroom. My heart stuttered as I opened it, the paper crisp under my fingers. His handwriting was the same as always, slanted and hurried, but the words were different. "Asterisk, Sarah. Asterisk," it began. "Asterisk, I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know I'm sorry. Not for the divorce, but for what I took from you. I saw your story in the magazine today. You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for." There was more, but I stopped reading, my throat tight. I didn't need his apology. I didn't need his validation. But the letter was a reminder, a quiet twist in the story I hadn't expected. He'd seen me, really seen me, for the first time in years. And it didn't change anything. I was already whole. I folded the letter and tucked it away, not because I wanted to keep it, but because it was part of the story, part of the fight. Then I went to the kitchen, poured a glass of wine, and stood by the window, the night stretching out beyond the glass. Tomorrow, Emily and I would make dinner, fill the house with laughter, with life, and I'd keep writing, keep fighting, keep building a world that was mine. The victory wasn't loud, but it was real, and it was enough. The Thanksgiving table was set with the good plates, the ones my mother had given me when Daniel and I got married. They were chipped now, a little faded, but they held a kind of quiet history, like the house itself. Emily was in the kitchen mashing potatoes, humming a song I didn't recognize. The smell of turkey and sage filled the air, and for the first time in months, I felt the edges of something like peace. Not the loud, triumphant kind, but the soft kind. The kind that settles in your bones when you realize you're exactly where you're supposed to be. I watched Emily move, her hands quick and sure, and I thought about how much she'd grown. She wasn't the little girl who'd climb into my lap during thunderstorms, but she was still mine, still the best part of me. I'd worried in those first months after Daniel left that the divorce would break her, that she'd carry the weight of our mistakes. But she was stronger than I'd given her credit for. Stronger than me, maybe. Last night when we'd stayed up talking, she'd told me about her classes, her friends, the way she was starting to figure out who she wanted to be. "I'm proud of you, Mom," she'd said, out of nowhere, her voice soft. "You didn't let him win." I'd nodded, my throat too tight to answer, but her words had stayed with me, a warmth I carried into today. As I set out the cranberry sauce, I remembered a Thanksgiving from years ago when Emily was 6. Daniel had been late, stuck at the office, or so he'd said. I'd kept the food warm, kept Emily entertained with stories about my own childhood, how my father used to sneak me extra pie when my mother wasn't looking, how he'd wink and say, "Don't tell, Sarah girl." That night, when Daniel finally came home, he'd barely eaten, just pushed the food around his plate and talked about work. I'd felt it then, the distance, but I'd pushed it down, told myself it was just a phase. Looking back, I wondered how many of those nights I'd spent lying to myself, building a life out of hope instead of truth. Now, though, the table was just for us, Emily and me. No pretending, no waiting for someone who wasn't coming. We sat down, the candles flickering, and she raised her glass of sparkling cider, a grin on her face. "To new beginnings," she said, and I echoed her, my voice steady. We ate, talked, laughed, and for a little while, the world outside the house didn't exist. It was just us, the clink of forks, the warmth of the room, the kind of moment you want to hold on to forever. After dinner, we cleaned up together, the rhythm of it familiar from years of holidays. As I washed the dishes, Emily dried, and she asked, "Mom, are you going to keep writing?" The question caught me off guard, not because it was strange, but because of the way she asked it, like she already knew the answer. I glanced at her, the dishwater warm on my hands, and said, "Yeah, I think I am." She nodded, like it was the most natural thing in the world, and then she told me she'd read my story in the magazine. "I found it online," she said, her voice quiet. "It made me cry, but not because it was sad, because it was you." I stopped washing, the plate slippery in my hands, and looked at her. Her eyes were bright, not with tears, but with something else. Pride, maybe, or love. "I didn't know you'd seen it," I said. And she shrugged, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You didn't have to tell me. I knew it was you." That moment, standing there in the kitchen with the sink full of bubbles, and my daughter beside me, felt like a gift. Not the kind you plan for, but the kind that comes when you least expect it, when life reminds you it's still good. Later, we sat on the couch, a blanket over our laps, and watched an old movie, one of those black and white ones my mother used to love. Emily fell asleep halfway through, her head on my shoulder, and I stayed there, not wanting to move. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't empty. It was full of us, of the life we were building, piece by piece. I thought about Daniel's letter, still tucked away in my notebook, and I realized I didn't need to read the rest of it. Whatever he'd written, it couldn't change what I'd done, what I was doing. I'd taken back my story, not just from him, but from the part of me that had believed I wasn't enough. The next morning, Emily left early to meet a friend in town, promising to be back for dinner. I stood on the porch, waving as her car disappeared down the street, the air cold and sharp against my skin. The neighborhood was waking up, the sound of a lawnmower in the distance, the smell of wood smoke from someone's chimney. I went inside and pulled out my notebook, not to write, but to read. I flipped through the pages, the stories I'd written, the fragments of my life I'd poured onto paper. And then I found something I hadn't noticed before. A note, tucked between the pages, in my father's handwriting. It was old, the paper brittle, the ink faded. I'd forgotten he'd written it. A letter he'd given me the summer before he died, when I was 17 and about to leave for college. My hands shook as I unfolded it, the memory of that day rushing back. He'd been sick then, his face thin, but his eyes were still sharp, still full of the man he'd been before the drinking took him. Asterisk Sarah girl. Asterisk, the letter began. You're going out into the world, and I won't be there to watch. But you don't need me. You've got a fire in you, even if you don't know it yet. Don't let anyone dim it. Not a man, not a dream, not even yourself. I'm proud of you, always. At the bottom, he'd drawn a little bird, like the one he'd carved that day on the porch. I sat there, the letter in my hands, and I cried. Not the loud, wrenching kind, but the quiet kind, the kind that feels like letting go. I hadn't known I needed his words, not until that moment. All these years, I'd carried his voice in me, his belief in me, even when I'd forgotten it. The letter was a twist I hadn't seen coming, a piece of my past that fit perfectly into the present, like a key turning in a lock. It wasn't just about my father. It was about me, about the fire he'd seen, the one I was finally starting to feel again. I spent the rest of the day writing, not for the magazine, but for myself. I wrote about the porch, the bird, the way my father's hands had moved, steady and sure, steady. I wrote about the years I'd spent trying to be someone else's version of enough, and the moment I'd stopped. I wrote about Emily, about the house, about the woman I was becoming. The words came easily, like they'd been waiting for me to find them. And when I finished, I felt lighter, like I'd set something down, something I'd carried too long. That evening, Emily came home, her cheeks pink from the cold, and we made soup together, the kitchen warm and bright. We talked about small things, her friend's new job, the dog she wanted to adopt someday, the way the stars looked clearer out here than in the city. But beneath it all, there was a current, a quiet understanding that we were okay, that we were building something new. I didn't tell her about the letter, not yet. It was mine for now. A piece of my story I'd share when the time was right. As I lay in bed that night, the house settling around me, I thought about the future. Not the big, sweeping kind, but the small kind. The mornings I'd wake up to, the stories I'd write, the moments I'd share with Emily. I thought about the garden I'd plant in the spring, the way the soil would feel under my fingers, the way it would grow because I'd tended it. And I thought about my father, his voice in my head, his belief in me. The revenge I'd wanted wasn't just about Daniel, I realized. It was about taking back my life, my fire, my story. And I had, not with anger, but with love, for Emily, for myself, for the woman I was still becoming. The stars were bright outside my window, and I fell asleep with a quiet smile, the kind that comes when you know you're home. The weeks after Thanksgiving slipped by in a quiet rhythm, the kind that feels like healing even when you don't notice it happening. Winter settled over Columbus, the air sharp with frost, the trees bare against a sky that seemed to hold its breath. I'd always loved this time of year, the way it forced you to slow down, to find warmth in small things. A mug of tea, a blanket, the glow of a lamp against the early dark. The house felt different now, not just mine in name, but in spirit. I'd started leaving the windows uncovered at night, letting the moonlight spill across the floor, as if I was inviting the world back in. Work kept me grounded. The dental office was busier than usual, with holiday checkups and kids home from school needing fillings. I'd been there so long, 15 years now, that the routine was second nature. Answering phones, calming nervous patients, joking with Dr. Ellis about his terrible taste in ties. But lately, I'd started to notice the people behind the appointments, their stories woven into the small talk. Mrs. Carter, who came in every 6 months, told me about her husband's passing last spring, her voice steady but her eyes distant. Mr. Patel, always early, shared stories of his grandkids, pulling out his phone to show me blurry photos. I listened, really listened, and it made me realize how much I'd missed by keeping my own story locked away. Writing became my way of opening up. I'd carve out time after work, sitting at the kitchen table with my notebook, the house quiet except for the hum of the fridge. The stories I wrote weren't just about me anymore. They were about the people I saw every day, the ones whose lives brushed against mine in fleeting, meaningful ways. I wrote about Mrs. Carter's garden, how she'd planted tulips after her husband died, because he'd loved them. I wrote about the way Mr. Patel's hands shook when he talked about his daughter moving across the country. And I wrote about myself, too. Not the big moments, but the small ones, like the way the coffee tasted sharper on mornings I felt strong, or the way the porch creaked under my weight when I stood there, watching the stars. The magazine kept publishing my work, and the checks, though small, started adding up. I opened a savings account, separate from the one Daniel and I had shared, and every deposit felt like a brick in a new foundation. Emily teased me about it when she called, saying, "Mom, you're going to be famous soon." I laughed, but her words stayed with me, not because I wanted fame, but because they meant she saw me as more than just her mother. She saw me as a woman with a life, a voice, a future. One evening in early December, I was at the grocery store, picking up ingredients for chili. The store was crowded, the air thick with the smell of pine from the Christmas trees by the entrance. I was in the canned goods aisle, reaching for tomatoes when I saw her. Lindsay, the woman Daniel had left me for. She was pushing a cart, her hair pulled back, a scarf loose around her neck. My heart stuttered, not with anger, but with a strange, hollow curiosity. I'd imagined this moment 100 times, what I'd say, how I'd feel. But now, standing there with a can in my hand, I felt nothing. Not nothing exactly, but a calm I hadn't expected. She didn't see me, and I didn't call out. I just watched her for a moment, the way she checked her phone, the way her shoulders slumped slightly, like she was carrying something heavy. And then I turned away, paid for my groceries, and drove home. That night, I wrote about it. Not about Lindsay, not directly, but about the way life surprises you, the way you can stand in a grocery store and realize you're not the person you were a year ago. I wrote about the weight of betrayal, how it doesn't vanish but changes, becomes something you can carry without breaking. When I finished, I sat back, my hands still on the notebook, and I thought about my father's letter, the one I'd found after Thanksgiving. His words, "Don't let anyone dim it," had become a kind of mantra, a reminder that my light was mine to protect, mine to grow. The next day I got a call from Margaret, my lawyer. Her voice was brisk as always, but there was a warmth to it I hadn't noticed before. "Sarah, I've got something for you," she said. "Can you come by the office?" I drove over after work, the city lights blurring through a light snow. Margaret's office was small, cluttered with files and photos of her kids, and she greeted me with a cup of coffee, the steam curling in the air. She slid a folder across her desk, her eyes steady on mine. "Daniel's lawyer reached out," she said. "He's not contesting the settlement anymore. But there's something else. He's transferring his share of the college fund to Emily's name, no strings attached." I blinked, the words sinking in slowly. The college fund had been a point of contention during the divorce, one of the few things Daniel had fought for, claiming he needed it for future expenses. I'd let it go, not because I didn't care, but because I'd trusted Emily would be okay, that we'd find a way. Now, though, here it was, a quiet concession, a piece of the past handed back without a fight. "Why?" I asked, my voice low. Margaret shrugged, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Maybe he read your story. Maybe he's trying to make amends. Does it matter?" It didn't, not really. But as I drove home, the folder on the passenger seat, I felt a twist in my chest, a mix of relief and something else. Gratitude, maybe, not for Daniel, but for the way life kept unfolding, kept giving me pieces to build with. I thought about a moment from my childhood, one I hadn't remembered in years. I was 8, sitting in the backyard with my mother, shelling peas. She'd been quiet that day, her hands moving quickly, and I'd asked her why she stayed with my father, even when he drank, even when he yelled. She'd looked at me, her eyes soft, and said, "Because I love him, Sarah, and because I love you. Sometimes love means staying, sometimes it means leaving." I hadn't understood then, but I did now. Love had kept me with Daniel for too long, but it was also what had pushed me to leave, to fight, to become. When I got home, I called Emily and told her about the fund. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "That's good, Mom. But you know I'd be okay either way, right?" I smiled, my eyes stinging, and said, "I know." We talked for a while longer, about her finals, about the snow in Columbus, about the chili I'd made. And when we hung up, I stood in the kitchen, the house warm around me, and I felt a quiet victory, not over Daniel, but over the part of me that had doubted I could do this. The next morning, I woke to an email from the magazine editor. They'd received letters from readers about my last story, more than ever before. One was from a woman in her 60s, who'd written, "*. Your words made me feel like I wasn't alone, like I could start again." I read it twice, then tucked it away, not to keep, but to carry. I went to work, answered phones, smiled at patients, and when I came home, I wrote again. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Because the fire my father had seen in me was burning now, steady and bright, and I wasn't going to let it dim. As I sat at the table, the snow falling softly outside, I thought about the spring, about the garden I'd plant, the stories I'd tell, the life I was building. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that was enough. The house creaked, the world turned, and I kept writing, one word at a time, into the quiet, beautiful unknown. The snow kept falling through December, blanketing the neighborhood in a hush that made everything feel softer, slower. I'd taken to walking in the evenings, just around the block, my boots crunching against the fresh powder. The air was cold enough to sting my cheeks, but I liked it. The way it woke me up, reminded me I was here, alive, moving forward. The houses glowed with Christmas lights, some neat and orderly, others a chaotic tangle that made me smile. I'd pass the same neighbors, nod at the same dogs, and sometimes I'd stop at the corner, where the street lamp cast a circle of light, and just breathe. It was a small ritual, but it was mine, a way of claiming the world again, one step at a time. Back home, I'd shake the snow from my coat and make tea. The kettle's whistle a familiar comfort. The house was starting to feel like a partner in my new life, not just a place to live. I'd hung a few of Emily's old drawings on the fridge, bright crayon sketches of trees and stars, and I'd started leaving my notebooks open on the table, no longer hiding them like a secret. Writing had become as natural as breathing, a way to make sense of the days, the years, the woman I was becoming. I wasn't chasing anything grand, just the truth, whatever shape it took. One morning, as I was getting ready for work, the phone rang. It was Dr. Ellis, his voice gruff but kind. "Sarah, can you come in a bit early? Got a new patient who's a nervous wreck, and you're better at calming folks than I am." I laughed, promised I'd be there, and hung up, a warmth spreading in my chest. I'd never thought of myself as particularly good at my job, just steady, reliable. But hearing Dr. Ellis say that, like it was a fact, made me realize how much I'd underestimated myself, not just at work, but in everything. The new patient was a woman named Clara, in her late 50s, with graying hair pulled into a loose bun and hands that fidgeted in her lap. She was there for a cleaning, but her eyes darted around the room like she was looking for an escape. I sat with her while Dr. Ellis prepped, chatting about nothing. The weather, the coffee shop down the street, the way the snow made everything look like a postcard. Slowly, her shoulders relaxed, and she started talking. Her husband had died 2 years ago, she said, and she'd been avoiding the dentist because it was one of the last places they'd gone together. "It's silly," she said, her voice low, but I didn't want to face it without him. I nodded, my heart aching in a way that felt familiar. "It's not silly," I said, and I meant it. I told her about my mother, how I'd avoided cooking her favorite recipes after she passed because the smell of them brought her back too sharply. Clara's eyes softened, and by the time Dr. Ellis came in, she was smiling, her hands still in her lap. As she left, she squeezed my arm and said, "You're a good listener, Sarah." "Thank you." I stood there, the office humming around me, and felt a quiet pride, not the loud kind, but the kind that settles deep, like roots. That evening I wrote about Clara, not her name or her story, but the way grief lingers in small places. Dentist chairs, kitchen counters, the scent of a stranger's perfume. I wrote about the way we carry people with us, even when they're gone, and how sometimes letting go means letting them live in the stories we tell. The words came easily, and when I finished, I realized I wasn't just writing for myself anymore. I was writing for Clara, for Mrs. Carter, for the women who read my stories and saw themselves in them. It was a responsibility, but not a heavy one. It was a gift. Christmas was quiet that year. Emily couldn't come home. Her finals ran late, and she was staying with a friend's family in Pittsburgh, but we video called on Christmas Eve, her face glowing on my laptop screen. She showed me the tiny tree she'd decorated with paper ornaments, and I showed her the wreath I'd hung on the front door, a simple one I'd made from pine cones I'd collected on my walks. We talked for hours, about nothing and everything, and when we hung up, I didn't feel alone. I felt connected, not just to her, but to the life I was building, one moment at a time. On Christmas morning, I woke to a package on my porch. No note, just my name scrawled on the box. Inside was a leather-bound journal, the kind I'd always wanted but never bought for myself, its pages thick and creamy, begging for ink. I turned it over, looking for a clue, but there was nothing. I thought it might be from Emily, but when I called to thank her, she laughed and said, "Mom, I wish I'd thought of that." But no. Margaret, maybe, or someone from work. I didn't know, and in a way it didn't matter. It felt like a sign, a quiet nudge from the universe to keep going, to keep writing. That afternoon I took my walk, the journal tucked under my arm. The snow was deeper now, the streets silent except for the occasional car. I stopped at the corner under the street lamp and opened the journal to the first page. I didn't write anything, not yet, but I stood there, the cold biting my fingertips, and I felt a memory surface, sharp and clear. I was 12, sitting in my father's truck, the radio playing softly. He'd just gotten sober again, and he was taking me to the library, a rare outing for us. "You love books, Sarah girl," he'd said, his voice rough but warm. "They're your way out, your way in. Don't ever stop reading. Don't ever stop dreaming." I'd nodded, not fully understanding, but his words had stayed with me, buried deep, waiting for the right moment to bloom. The journal felt like his words come to life, a reminder of the fire he'd seen in me, the one I was finally learning to trust. I went home, made tea, and started writing in it. Not a story, but a list of things I wanted, things I was grateful for, things I was still learning to believe in. I wrote about the house, the way it held me now, not as a cage, but as a home. I wrote about Emily, about the way her laugh could still make my heart lift. I wrote about myself, about the woman who'd sat in that courtroom and fought, not with anger, but with quiet, unshakable strength. A few days later, I got an email from a local bookstore. They'd seen my stories in the magazine and wanted to host a reading, just a small one, for the community. My first instinct was to say no. Reading my work aloud in front of strangers felt like standing naked in a spotlight. But then I thought about Clara, about the way she'd trusted me with her story. And I thought about my father, about the fire he'd believed in. I said yes, my hands trembling as I typed the reply, but my heart steady, sure. The reading was set for mid-January, and as the date approached, I practiced in front of the mirror, my voice shaky at first, then stronger. I chose 3 stories, one about the house, one about Emily, one about the moment I'd found the bank statements in the attic. They weren't perfect, but they were true, and that was enough. The night of the reading, the bookstore was warm, crowded with folding chairs and faces I recognized. Mrs. Carter, Mr. Patel, even Clara, who smiled at me from the back. Emily was there too, a surprise, her eyes bright as she hugged me before I started. I read, my voice steady, the words carrying me like a current. The room was quiet, but not the empty kind. It was the kind of quiet that listens, that feels. When I finished, there was applause, soft but real, and I stood there, my hands clasped, feeling like I'd crossed a threshold I hadn't known was there. Afterward, people came up to me, shared their own stories, their own losses and triumphs. Clara told me she'd started going to a grief group, that my story had given her the push she needed. Mrs. Carter pressed a tulip bulb into my hand, saying, "For your garden, Sarah. It'll bloom in spring." As I drove home with Emily, the car warm against the January cold, she reached for my hand and said, "You were amazing, Mom. I'm so proud of you." I smiled, my throat tight, and said, "I'm proud of us." And I was. Not just for the reading, but for everything. The fights we'd won, the ones we'd lost, the life we were building together and apart. The house was waiting for us, the porch light glowing, and as we stepped inside, I felt the weight of the night settle into something beautiful, something true. I was Sarah, and I was enough. The weeks after the bookstore reading carried a new kind of energy, like the first warm day after a long winter. I felt lighter, not because anything dramatic had changed, but because I was starting to trust the woman I was becoming. The house seemed to feel it too. The creaks in the floorboards sounded less like complaints and more like conversations, as if it was settling into its new life alongside mine. I'd started leaving the radio on low during the day, soft jazz filling the rooms, a habit I'd picked up from my mother. She'd always said music made a house feel alive, and now I understood what she meant. Work was the same, but different. I still answered phones, scheduled appointments, smiled at patients, but I carried myself with a quiet confidence I hadn't noticed before. Dr. Ellis picked up on it, teasing me one morning as he adjusted his garish Santa tie, left over from the holidays. "Sarah, you're glowing lately. Got a secret boyfriend I don't know about?" I laughed, shaking my head, and said, "Just happy, Doc. That's all." He raised an eyebrow like he didn't quite believe me, but he let it go, and I was grateful. Happiness was enough of an explanation, maybe for the first time in my life. Clara became a regular at the office, coming in for follow-ups she probably didn't need, but I didn't mind. We'd chat in the waiting room, her hands less fidgety now, her stories less about loss and more about the life she was rebuilding. She'd joined a gardening club, she told me, and was planning a trip to see her sister in Florida. "You inspired me, Sarah," she said one day, her voice matter of fact. "That reading you did. It made me think I could start over too." I didn't know what to say, so I just squeezed her hand, the warmth of her words settling into me like a seed. Writing kept me anchored. The journal from Christmas was filling up, its pages crowded with stories, reflections, fragments of memory. I wrote about the small things, the way the snow melted into puddles on the porch, the smell of bread baking in the oven, the sound of Emily's voice on the phone, bright with laughter. I wrote about the bigger things too, the way betrayal had carved me open but also set me free, the way love wasn't just about holding on, but about letting go, The magazine had asked for another piece, something about finding home, and I was working on it slowly, letting the words find their own shape. One Saturday in late January, I was cleaning out the garage, a task I'd avoided for years. It was a mess of old tools, boxes of holiday decorations, and things Daniel had left behind. A broken fishing rod, a stack of business books he'd never read. The air was cold, the concrete floor hard under my knees, but I felt a strange satisfaction in the work, like I was clearing space for something new. Tucked behind a pile of paint cans, I found a small wooden box, its lid carved with a simple floral pattern. My breath caught as I opened it, the hinges stiff with rust. Inside was a collection of my old things, letters I'd written to my parents from college, a locket my grandmother had given me, a photo of me and Daniel from our first year together, both of us laughing in a park, the sun in our eyes. But it was the letter at the bottom that stopped me. It was in my handwriting, dated the summer after my freshman year, addressed to myself. I'd forgotten I'd written it, a habit my English professor had encouraged. Write to your future self, Sarah. Tell her what you hope, what you fear. I sat on the garage floor, the cold seeping through my jeans, and read it. Asterisk. Dear Sarah Waltz, it began. Asterisk. I hope you're happy. I hope you're writing stories, the kind that make people feel something. I'm scared right now. Scared I won't be enough. Scared I'll lose myself in someone else. But I believe in you. Don't forget that. The words blurred as my eyes filled, not with sadness, but with a kind of awe. I'd been so young, so full of hope and fear, and somehow I'd known I might need this reminder, this piece of myself, waiting in a box for the right moment. That letter was a twist I hadn't seen coming, a voice from my past reaching out to hold me in the present. I took the box inside, set it on the kitchen table, and read the letter again, tracing the loops of my own handwriting. I thought about the girl who'd written it, the one who dreamed of stories but hadn't known how to fight for them. I wanted to tell her she'd be okay, that she'd lose her way but find it again, that she'd be stronger than she ever imagined. But I didn't need to. She was still in me, her fire burning alongside the woman I was now. The next day I went to the bookstore, not for a reading, but to browse. The owner, A kind-eyed woman named Rachel greeted me like an old friend. "Sarah, you've got to come back," she said, pouring me a cup of coffee from the pot she kept behind the counter. "People are still talking about your reading." I smiled, stirring sugar into my cup, and said, "Maybe I will." We talked for a while, about books, about the town, about the way winter made everything feel like a story waiting to be told. Before I left, she handed me a flyer for a local writing group, her eyes twinkling. "You'd be a great fit," she said. "Think about it." I did think about it. All the way home, the flyer folded in my pocket. A writing group felt like a leap, not because I was afraid, but because it meant stepping fully into this new version of myself. I'd spent so long writing alone, in the quiet of my kitchen, that sharing my work with others felt like opening a door I wasn't sure I was ready for. But that night, as I sat with my journal, I wrote about the idea, about the fear and the possibility, and I realized I wasn't just writing for myself anymore. I was writing for the people who'd heard my stories, who'd seen themselves in them, who'd reminded me that stories are how we connect, how we heal. The following week, I went to the writing group. It was held in the bookstore's back room, a cozy space with mismatched chairs and a table covered in coffee stains. There were 6 of us, a mix of ages and backgrounds, each with a story to share. I was nervous, my hands sweaty as I read a piece about the garage, about the letter I'd found. When I finished, the room was quiet, and for a moment I thought I'd made a mistake. But then a woman named Ellen, her hair streaked with silver, said, "That's beautiful, Sarah. It's like you're giving us permission to find our own letters." The others nodded, and we talked, not just about writing, but about life, about loss, about starting over, about the small victories that matter most. Driving home, the stars bright above the snow-covered streets, I felt a quiet joy, the kind that comes when you realize you're not alone. The writing group became a weekly ritual, a place where I could be myself, not just Sarah the receptionist, or Sarah the ex-wife, but Sarah the writer, the woman with stories to tell. And with each meeting, I felt the fire my father had seen in me grow, not louder, but steadier, brighter. One evening in early February, I was sorting through the mail when I found a letter. Not a bill or a catalogue, but a real letter, addressed to me in a handwriting I didn't recognize. My heart skipped as I opened it, the paper crisp under my fingers. It was from Rachel, the bookstore owner. "Asterisk Sarah. Asterisk," she wrote. "Asterisk, I hope you don't mind. But I was the one who left the journal on your porch. I saw you at the reading, saw the way your words moved people, and I wanted to give you something to keep going. You're a gift to this town, to all of us. Keep writing." I stood there, the letter in my hands, and smiled, not because of the journal, but because of what it meant. I wasn't just rebuilding my life. I was part of something bigger, a community that saw me, that believed in me. I wrote back to Rachel, a simple thank you. But I didn't stop there. I kept writing, kept walking, kept living. The spring was coming. I could feel it in the air, and with it, the promise of new growth, new stories, new beginnings. The house was mine, the fire was mine, and I was ready for whatever came next. February softened into March, the snow giving way to mud, and the first tentative buds on the trees. The air carried a promise of spring, that raw, earthy smell that makes you believe in new beginnings. I'd started spending more time outside, raking the yard, clearing the flower beds for the garden I'd promised myself. The physical work felt good. The ache in my shoulders a reminder that I was here, that I was building something tangible. I'd bought seeds, zinnias, sunflowers, a packet of wildflowers just because they felt like hope, and I'd imagined them blooming, bright against the faded paint of the house, a quiet rebellion against the years I'd let the yard go to weeds. The writing group had become a cornerstone of my week, a place where I felt seen in a way I hadn't expected. We'd meet every Wednesday, crowded around the bookstore's table, sharing stories and silences that held as much weight as the words. Ellen, the silver-haired woman who'd spoken after my first reading, had become a friend. She was a retired teacher, sharp-witted and kind, with a laugh that filled the room. One night, after we'd finished, she invited me for coffee at the diner across the street. We sat in a booth, the vinyl cracked under our weight, and talked about everything. Her years teaching, my years raising Emily, the way life surprises you with its twists. "You've got a gift, Sarah," she said, stirring cream into her coffee. "Not just for writing, but for seeing people. Don't stop." I smiled, my hands wrapped around my mug, and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. Emily came home for spring break, her car rattling into the driveway, just as I was planting the first of the seeds. She bounded out, her curls wild, and hugged me so tight I laughed, the dirt on my hands smudging her jacket. "Mom, it smells like home," she said, sniffing the air, and I knew she meant the earth, the grass, the faint tang of the neighbor's barbecue. We spent the week together, not doing anything grand, just cooking, walking, talking. She helped me in the garden, her hands quick as she pressed seeds into the soil, and we laughed about the time she'd tried to plant a gummy worm when she was 5, convinced it would grow into a candy tree. Those moments, small and ordinary, were the ones I held closest, the ones that reminded me why I'd fought so hard to keep this life. One evening, as we sat on the porch with mugs of tea, Emily told me she'd been writing too, not stories, but a journal, something to make sense of college, of the divorce, of growing up. "I think I got it from you," she said, her voice soft, her eyes on the sunset. "The way you write, it's like you're figuring out who you are. I want that too." I reached for her hand, my throat tight, and said, "You're already figuring it out, Em. You're braver than I was at your age." She smiled, a little shy, and we sat there in silence, the sky turning from gold to purple, the world holding us gently. The writing group had inspired me to take another step. Rachel, the bookstore owner, had mentioned a local literary festival in April, a small event where writers could share their work. She'd encouraged me to submit, and after weeks of hesitating, I did. I sent 3 stories, including the one about the letter I'd found in the garage, the one to my younger self. A week later, I got an email. They'd accepted me, not just to read, but to lead a workshop on personal storytelling. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding, and then I laughed, a sound that echoed in the quiet house. It wasn't just pride. It was disbelief, the kind that comes when you realize you're living a life you never thought possible. The festival was a whirlwind of nerves and joy. I read my stories to a room of strangers and friends. Clara was there, and Mrs. Carter, and even Dr. Ellis, who clapped louder than anyone. The workshop was smaller, just 10 people, but it felt intimate, like we were sharing secrets. I talked about finding truth in the small moments, about writing as a way to heal. And they listened, their faces open, their stories spilling out in turn. One woman, about my age, told me afterward that she'd started writing again after years of silence. "Because of me. You made it feel possible," she said, her voice breaking, and I hugged her, my own eyes wet, because I knew exactly what she meant. That night, I came home to a voicemail from Margaret, my lawyer. Her voice was warm, almost conspiratorial. "Sarah, I've got something you'll want to hear. Call me back." I did, my hands shaky as I dialed. She told me Daniel had contacted her again, Not about the divorce, but about my writing. He'd seen the festival announcement in the local paper and wanted to send me a message through her to avoid overstepping. He said he's proud of you, Margaret said, her tone neutral. He's not asking for anything, just wanted you to know. I thanked her, hung up, and stood in the kitchen, the house dark except for the glow of the porch light seeping through the window. I didn't feel anger, or sadness, or even triumph. I felt distant, like Daniel was a chapter I'd closed, his pride a footnote that didn't change the story. But the message was a twist, a quiet echo of the letter he'd sent after the courtroom, and it made me think of my mother's words from years ago, about love meaning different things at different times. I'd loved Daniel once, enough to build a life with him, but that love had changed, not into hate, but into something else. Acceptance, maybe, or release. I didn't need his pride, but I was glad he saw me, even if it was too late to matter. The next morning, I woke early and went to the garden. The seeds were starting to sprout, tiny green shoots pushing through the soil, fragile, but determined. I knelt there, the earth cool under my knees, and thought about my father, about the bird he'd carved, the fire he'd believed in. I thought about the letter I'd written to myself, the one that had waited in the garage all those years. And I thought about the woman I was now, the one who'd fought for her home, her voice, her life. The garden was a promise, not just to the spring, but to myself. A promise to keep growing, to keep writing, to keep living. I stood, brushing the dirt from my hands, and went inside to make coffee. The house was quiet, but it was a living quiet, full of possibility. I opened my journal, the one from Rachel, and started writing, not a story, but a reflection, a way to capture this moment. I wrote about the garden, about the way the shoots looked like hope made visible. I wrote about Emily, about the way her courage mirrored mine, even when I hadn't seen it. I wrote about the community I'd found, the people who'd become my anchors. Clara, Ellen, Rachel, the strangers who'd shared their stories at the festival. And then, as the coffee cooled and the morning light spilled across the table, I wrote about myself. Not the Sarah who'd been betrayed, or the Sarah who'd fought, but the Sarah who was here, now, whole. I wrote about the fire my father had seen, the one I'd carried through years of doubt and silence, the one that burned brighter now, not because I'd won, but because I'd chosen to live. The phone rang, breaking the silence, and I smiled when I saw Emily's name on the screen. "Mom," she said, her voice bright, "I'm thinking of coming home this weekend. Can we plant more flowers?" I laughed, the sound warm in my chest, and said, "Yeah, Em. Let's plant the whole yard." We talked for a while, making plans, and when we hung up, I went back to my journal, the words waiting like old friends. The spring was here, and so was I. The house stood steady, the garden grew, and I kept writing, one word at a time, into a future I was ready to meet. The spring unfolded slowly, each day a little warmer, a little greener, as if the world was waking up alongside me. The garden was coming alive, the wildflowers and sunflowers stretching toward the sun, their colors a quiet defiance against the gray of the past year. I'd spend mornings out there, my hands in the dirt, the smell of earth grounding me in a way nothing else could. It wasn't just about the flowers. It was about tending something, watching it grow, believing in its right to bloom. Every sprout felt like a mirror, reflecting the work I'd done on myself, the slow, steady rebuilding of a life I hadn't known I could claim. Emily's weekend visit turned into a tradition. She'd drive home every few weeks, her car packed with textbooks and laundry, and we'd spend hours in the garden or the kitchen, talking about everything and nothing. She was changing, too. not in big, dramatic ways, but in the quiet confidence of someone finding their place in the world. She'd started a blog, she told me, a mix of journal entries and essays about college life, and it was gaining traction. "It's not like your writing, Mom," she said one afternoon, her hands dusted with soil as we planted marigolds. "But it feels good, like I'm figuring things out." I smiled, my heart full, and said, "That's exactly what it's supposed to feel like." Her words stayed with me, a reminder that we were both growing, both finding our voices. I thought about my mother, how she'd never had the chance to find hers, her life shaped by my father's struggles, and her own quiet endurance. I wished I could tell her about this, about the garden, about Emily, about the woman I was becoming. But in a way, I felt her with me, in the way I rolled out dough for biscuits, in the way I hummed her old songs when I thought no one was listening. She'd given me strength, even if she hadn't known how to use it herself, and I was grateful for that. For her, for the complicated love that had shaped me. The writing group kept meeting, and with each session, I felt more at home. Ellen had started calling us the Storytellers, a name that stuck, and we'd laugh about it, but it felt true. We were telling stories, not just on paper, but in the way we listened, the way we showed up for each other. One night, Rachel joined us, her bookstore apron still on, and shared a poem she'd written about her late mother. It was raw, beautiful, and when she finished, the room was silent, not with awkwardness, but with reverence. I realized then that this group wasn't just about writing. It was about community, about holding space for each other's truths. That sense of community spilled into other parts of my life. Clara invited me to her gardening club, a small group of women who met at the community center to swap tips and seedlings. I went, hesitant at first, but their warmth pulled me in. We'd sit around a table cluttered with coffee cups and plant catalogs, talking about roses and compost, but also about life, divorces, kids, the small victories that kept us going. One woman, Diane, told me she'd read my stories in the magazine and kept them on her nightstand. "They're like a friend," she said, her eyes crinkling. "They remind me I'm not alone." I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded. But her words stayed with me, a quiet gift I carried home. Work, too, felt different. I'd always seen my job as a necessity, a way to pay the bills, but now I saw it as a thread in the tapestry of my life. The patients weren't just names on a schedule. They were people with stories, fears, hopes. I started keeping a small notebook at the front desk, jotting down moments. A child's shy smile, an elderly man's joke, the way Mrs. Carter's hands steadied when she talked about her tulips. They weren't stories yet, just fragments, but they felt alive, like seeds waiting for the right season. One afternoon in late April, I was at the office sorting through insurance forms when Dr. Ellis called me into his office. He was retiring, he said, his voice gruff but warm. "Been at this too long, Sarah. Time to let someone younger take the chair." I nodded, a pang of sadness mixing with respect. He'd been a steady presence, not just a boss, but a kind of anchor. "But here's the thing," he said, leaning back in his chair. "The new dentist, Dr. Nguyen. She's young, sharp, but she needs someone like you. I told her you're the heart of this place. She wants you to stay on, maybe take on more. Manage the office, train the staff. What do you say?" I blinked, the offer catching me off guard. I'd never thought of myself as anything more than a receptionist, but the way he said it, like it was obvious, made me pause. "Can I think about it?" I asked, and he nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. "Take your time, but don't sell yourself short, Sarah. You're more than you think." I left his office, my mind spinning, and drove home through a soft spring rain. the wipers a steady rhythm against the quiet. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, my journal open, and wrote about the offer. Not just the job, but what it meant. The chance to step into a bigger version of myself, to trust that I could handle it. I thought about my father, about the way he'd believed in me, even when I hadn't. I thought about the letter I'd found, the one from my younger self, urging me to keep dreaming. And I thought about Emily, about the way she was carving her own path, fearless in her own quiet way. By the time I closed the journal, I knew I'd say yes. Not because it was easy, but because it was mine to choose. The next morning I called Dr. Ellis and accepted the role. He laughed, a sound that carried years of knowing me, and said, "Knew you'd come around, Sarah. You're gonna be great." I hung up, a smile spreading across my face, and went to the garden, the sun warm on my shoulders. The wildflowers were blooming now, a riot of color that made me think of Emily's crayon drawings, of the life we were building together. A week later, I got an unexpected package in the mail, a small envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, old and creased, of me and my father on the porch the day he'd carved the wooden bird. I was 10, my hair in braids, my smile wide as I held the bird up to the camera. On the back, in my mother's handwriting, was a note. Asterisk Sarah, your father loved you so much. Keep shining. My breath caught, tears pricking my eyes, as I realized what this was. A final gift. A piece of my past sent by someone who'd known me then, maybe a cousin or a family friend who'd found it in an old album. There was no way to know, and in a way it didn't matter. It was a twist, a quiet miracle, tying my father's love to the woman I was now. I framed the photo and hung it in the living room, next to Emily's drawings. It wasn't just a memory. It was a reminder of the fire he'd seen, of the strength I'd found, of the love that had carried me through. That evening, I wrote about it, not for the magazine, but for myself, for the girl in the photo, for the woman who'd survived. I wrote about the porch, the bird, the way my father's hands had moved. Steady and sure. I wrote about the garden, about the way it bloomed because I'd tended it, because I'd believed in it. And I wrote about the future, about the stories I'd tell, the life I'd live, not just for me, but for everyone who'd ever felt invisible, who'd ever needed to find their way back. As I closed the journal, the house settled around me, the night soft outside the windows. Emily would be home soon. The garden would keep growing, and I'd keep writing, one word at a time. The victory wasn't loud, but it was real, a quiet triumph of love, resilience, and the fire that had never gone out. I was Sarah, and I was home. The days grew longer as May approached, the sun lingering in the sky like it was reluctant to leave. The garden was a riot of color now, the wildflowers swaying in the breeze, the sunflowers standing tall like sentinels. I'd sit on the porch in the evenings, a glass of iced tea sweating in my hand, and watch the neighborhood come alive. Kids on bikes, neighbors watering their lawns, the hum of life that felt like a heartbeat. It was a simple thing, but it filled me with a quiet joy, the kind that comes when you realize you're not just surviving, but living. My new role at the dental office started the first week of May, and it was both daunting and exhilarating. Dr. Nguyen was young, barely 30, with a quick smile and a mind that moved a mile a minute. She was everything Dr. Ellis wasn't, tech-savvy, ambitious, full of ideas for modernizing the practice. But she leaned on me in a way that made me feel valued, not just needed. I was no longer just answering phones. I was ordering supplies, training a new receptionist, streamlining the schedule to make the days flow smoother. The first few weeks were a blur of learning curves and late nights, but I found I liked the challenge, the way it stretched me, forced me to trust my instincts. One afternoon, as I was showing the new receptionist, a shy girl named Mia, how to handle insurance claims, Dr. Nguyen poked her head into the front office. "Sarah, you're a lifesaver," she said, her eyes bright. "I don't know how this place ran without you in charge." I laughed, brushing it off, but her words stayed with me, a small spark of pride that warmed me through the day. I thought about my father, how he'd always said I had a knack for fixing things. Broken toys, tangled arguments, his own rough edges when he was sober. I hadn't seen it as a gift back then, just something I did to keep the peace. But now, managing the office, tending the garden, writing my stories, I realized it was more than that. It was strength, the kind that builds quietly, piece by piece. Emily came home for the summer, her car packed with more than just laundry this time. Boxes of books, a small succulent she'd named Fred, a guitar she was teaching herself to play. She filled the house with energy, her laughter echoing through the rooms, her music a soft backdrop to our evenings. We'd cook together, experimenting with recipes we found online, and she'd tease me about my newfound boss lady status at work. "Mom, you're running the show now," she'd say, grinning as she chopped vegetables. "Pretty soon you'll have your own empire." I'd roll my eyes, but I loved it, the way she saw me as someone capable, someone whole. One evening, as we sat in the garden, the air thick with the scent of blooming jasmine, Emily told me she'd submitted one of her blog posts to a national magazine. "It's a long shot," she said, her voice casual but her eyes bright with hope. "But I figured, why not? You did it. So maybe I can too." I reached for her hand, my heart swelling, and said, "You're already doing it, Em. You're braver than you know." She smiled, a little shy, and we sat there, the crickets starting their song, the stars winking above us. I thought about my own submissions, the stories I'd sent out into the world, and how they'd come back to me in ways I hadn't expected. Letters from readers, invitations to read, a community that held me up. The writing group was still a weekly anchor, but it had grown, new faces joining the circle. Ellen had started bringing cookies. Rachel would slip in with a thermos of coffee, and we'd spend as much time laughing as we did writing. One night, I shared a story about the garden, about the way the wildflowers had bloomed despite my doubts, about the way they reminded me of myself. When I finished, Clara, who'd been quiet lately, spoke up. "That's me, Sarah," she said, her voice steady. "I didn't think I could bloom again, but I am, because of you." The room went still, and I felt tears prick my eyes, not from sadness, but from the weight of her words, the way they connected us, root to root. That connection spilled into the gardening club too. Diane, the woman who'd kept my stories on her nightstand, invited me to her house for a potluck with the group. It was a warm Saturday, the kind that feels like summer's promise, and we sat in her backyard, plates balanced on our laps, talking about everything from mulch to marriage. Diane's husband had left her years ago, she told me later, as we washed dishes in her cluttered kitchen. "I thought it was the end of me," she said, her hands busy with a sponge. "But then I read your stories, and I saw you building something new. It made me want to try." I hugged her, the dishwater dripping onto the floor, and felt a quiet triumph, not over Daniel or the past, but over the fear that had once held me back. In mid-May, I got a call from the literary festival organizers. They'd received feedback from my workshop, they said, and it was overwhelming. People wanted more. They asked if I'd consider leading a series of writing classes at the community center, not just for the festival, but year-round. My first instinct was to hesitate, to doubt I was qualified. But then I thought about Clara, about Diane, about the women who'd found their voices because I'd shared mine. "Yes," I said, my voice steady. And when I hung up, I laughed, a sound that echoed in the quiet house. It wasn't just a yes to the classes. It was a yes to myself, to the life I was building, to the fire that kept burning. The next day I was in the garden, pulling weeds, when a car pulled into the driveway. I stood, brushing the dirt from my hands, and saw Rachel, the bookstore owner, stepping out, a small package in her hands. "Sarah, I've got something for you," she said, her eyes twinkling. She handed me the package, a plain brown envelope, and I opened it to find a copy of my first published story, framed, the magazine's logo bright against the glass. "I thought you should have this," she said. "It's where it started, but it's not where it ends." I hugged her, my throat tight, and as she drove away I stood there, the frame heavy in my hands, feeling the weight of her belief in me. That evening, I hung the frame in the living room, next to the photo of me and my father. It wasn't just a story. It was a milestone, a piece of the path I'd walked to get here. I thought about the letter I'd found in the garage, the one from my younger self, and the photo from my mother's handwriting, the one that had arrived like a gift from the past. And then, as I stood there, the house quiet around me, I remembered something else. A moment from college, one I'd buried under years of marriage and motherhood. I'd been in a writing class, reading a story aloud, my voice shaking. The professor, a stern woman with kind eyes, had stopped me afterward and said, "Sarah, you have a voice. Don't let the world silence it." I'd nodded, embarrassed, but her words had stayed with me, a seed planted long before I knew how to tend it. That memory was a twist, a final thread tying my past to my present, my dreams to my reality. I'd been a writer all along, even when I'd forgotten, even when I'd let Daniel's indifference dim my light. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I was Sarah, the woman who'd fought for her home, her voice, her life. I was Sarah, the mother who'd raised a daughter to be brave. I was Sarah, the friend, the storyteller, the gardener, the woman who'd learned to bloom. I went to the kitchen, poured a glass of wine and sat at the table, my journal open. I wrote about the frame, about Rachel's gift, about the professor's words. I wrote about the garden, about the way it grew because I'd tended it, because I'd believed in it. I wrote about Emily, about the way her courage mirrored mine, even when I hadn't seen it. And I wrote about myself, about the fire that had never gone out, the one that burned brighter now, not because I'd won, but because I'd chosen to live. The house was quiet, but it was a living quiet, full of possibility. The garden bloomed. Emily would be home soon, and I'd keep writing, keep teaching, keep growing. The victory was mine, not loud but real, a quiet triumph of love, resilience, and the fire that had carried me home. The summer arrived with a gentle heat, the kind that wraps around you like a familiar embrace. The garden was in full bloom now, a vibrant patchwork of wildflowers, sunflowers, and marigolds that seemed to hum with life. I'd added a small bench under the oak tree in the backyard, a place to sit and watch the world unfold, the bees dancing from petal to petal, the way the light shifted through the leaves, the quiet rhythm of a life I'd fought to make mine. Every morning I'd take my coffee out there, the mug warm in my hands, and let the stillness settle into me. It wasn't just peace. It was presence, the kind that comes when you know you're exactly where you're meant to be. Emily was home for the summer, her laughter filling the house like music. She'd gotten that magazine submission accepted, a small piece about finding herself in the chaos of college, and we'd celebrated with pizza and a bottle of sparkling cider, toasting to her words, to mine, to us. She was working part-time at the bookstore with Rachel, shelving books and charming customers with her quick wit. "I think I get why you love this place," she told me one evening, her feet propped on the porch railing, a glass of lemonade in her hand. It's like the stories are alive, waiting for someone to find them. I smiled, my heart full, and thought about how much she'd grown, how much we'd both grown, side by side, root to root. The writing classes at the community center had started in June, and they were a revelation. I'd been nervous at first, standing in front of a room of strangers. But the moment I started talking, about stories, about truth, about the small moments that make us human, the nerves melted away. There were 12 students, a mix of ages and backgrounds, each with a story to tell. Clara was there, her notebook filled with sketches of flowers alongside her words, and Diane, who wrote about her childhood with a clarity that took my breath away. We'd sit in a circle, sharing drafts, laughing, sometimes crying, and I realized I wasn't just teaching. I was learning, too, about resilience, about connection, about the way stories weave us together. The writing group was still my anchor, a weekly ritual that felt like coming home. Ellen had started calling me the Glue, a nickname I laughed off but secretly cherished. We'd expanded the group, inviting new members, and the bookstore's back room was crowded now, the air thick with coffee and possibility. One night, Rachel surprised us with a gift, a handmade sign for the door that read, "The Storyteller's Room." We cheered, and I felt a lump in my throat, not just for the sign, but for what it meant. This wasn't just a group. It was a family, one I'd found when I needed it most. Work was a steady rhythm, the office humming under my care. Dr. Nguyen and I had found a groove, her energy balancing my calm, and the staff, Mia, the new receptionist, and the hygienists, looked to me for guidance. I'd never seen myself as a leader, but I was learning to step into it, to trust my voice. One afternoon, Mia, who was usually quiet, came to me with a question about a patient's file, then hesitated, her eyes bright. "Sarah, can I tell you something?" she asked. I nodded, and she told me she'd started writing, inspired by the stories I'd shared at the office. I didn't think I had anything to say, she said, her voice soft. "But you made me believe I do." I hugged her, the files forgotten, and felt a quiet pride, not just in her, but in the ripple effect of my own courage. The gardening club had become another kind of family. We'd meet at the community center, or in someone's backyard, swapping plants and stories, our hands stained with dirt. Diane and I had grown close, our conversations stretching beyond gardening to the deeper parts of life, love, loss, the small victories that keep us going. One evening, as we sat in her yard, the air heavy with the scent of roses, she handed me a small pot with a tulip bulb nestled in the soil. "For your garden," she said, her eyes crinkling. "And for you, Sarah. You're blooming too." I took it, my throat tight, and thought about Mrs. Carter, about the tulip bulb she'd given me at the bookstore reading, about the way these women had become my roots, holding me steady as I grew. In late July, I was cleaning out the attic again, a task I'd taken to with a kind of reverence, like unearthing pieces of my own history. Tucked in a corner, under a pile of old blankets, I found a small notebook, its cover faded, its pages brittle. It was my mother's, filled with recipes, grocery lists, and, to my surprise, fragments of poetry. Her handwriting was delicate, almost hesitant, as if she hadn't trusted her own words. Asterisk. The sky holds its breath tonight. One line read, asterisk waiting for the stars to speak. I sat there, the attic dust settling around me, and read every word, my heart aching with love and regret. I'd never known she wrote, never known she'd had this quiet, beautiful voice. It was a twist, a final gift from her, a reminder that she'd been more than the woman who'd endured, that she'd had dreams, too, even if she'd buried them. I brought the notebook downstairs and set it on the kitchen table, next to my journal. That night, I wrote about her, about the poetry she'd hidden, about the strength she'd given me without ever saying it aloud. I wrote about the way her hands had moved, quick and sure, shelling peas or folding laundry, and the way her eyes had softened when she looked at me. I wrote about the house, about the way it held her memory, my father's, my own. And I wrote about myself, about the woman who'd found her voice, not just in spite of the pain, but because of it. The next day I took the notebook to the writing group and shared one of her poems, my voice steady but thick with emotion. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that listens, and when I finished, Ellen reached for my hand, her eyes wet. "She'd be so proud of you, Sarah," she said, and I nodded, unable to speak, because I knew it was true. My mother's poetry wasn't just a memory, it was a bridge, connecting her dreams to mine, her silence to my voice. As August approached, I started planning a new project. A collection of stories, not just mine, but those of the women in my life. Clara's journey through grief, Diane's quiet resilience, Ellen's sharp wit, Mia's budding courage, Emily's fearless heart. I wanted to weave them together, to show how we bloom, how we break and rebuild, how we carry each other. I pitched the idea to the magazine, and they loved it, offering a special issue if I could deliver by fall. It was a big undertaking, but I said yes, not because it was easy, but because it was right. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the garden in shades of gold, Emily and I sat on the bench under the oak tree. She was strumming her guitar, the notes soft and halting, and I was sketching ideas for the collection, my journal open in my lap. "Mom," she said, pausing her playing, "do you ever think about how far you've come?" I looked at her, her face glowing in the fading light, and smiled. "Every day," I said. "But it's not just me. It's us. It's everyone who's been part of this." She nodded, her eyes bright, and we sat there, the garden alive around us, the future stretching out like a blank page. I thought about my father, about the bird he'd carved, the fire he'd seen in me. I concurrent thought about my mother, about the poetry she'd hidden, the love she'd poured into me. I thought about Daniel, about the betrayal that had broken me open but also set me free. And I thought about the women, Clara, Diane, Ellen, Rachel, Mia, Emily, who'd become my community, my roots, my wings. The revenge I'd sought wasn't about him, not anymore. It was about this, about the life I'd built, the stories I'd told, the love I'd found in myself and others. The house stood steady, its windows catching the last of the light. The garden bloomed wild and free, a testament to the care I'd given it. Emily started playing again, a melody that felt like hope, and I picked up my pen, the words flowing as naturally as breath. I was Sarah, the writer, the mother, the friend, the woman who'd fought and bloomed and loved. The fire my father had seen was mine, burning bright, and it would carry me forward into the stories still waiting to be told.